We don't have the first copy. We don't have copies of the copy. We don't have copies of the 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 copies. There are more differences in our manuscripts than there are words in the New Testament. There are more differences in our manuscripts than there are words in the New Testament. There are more differences in our manuscripts than there are words in the New Testament.
That last one should look familiar because that is from our debate in 2009. And so there are more differences in the manuscripts than there are words in the New Testament. There are about 138, just over 138,000 words in the New Testament and estimates of 400 to 500,000 variants. And so the statement is true, but what does it mean? Because he himself will admit the vast majority of those differences are not even translatable. You can't even explain in English what the difference would be. So many of those. Let's put it this way. There are more variants related to the movable new in the New Testament than there are words in the New Testament. What does that mean? So? That means that scribes struggled with movable news, just like most first-year Greek students do. The movable new does not change the meaning of anything. So what is that supposed to communicate? Well, it communicates to his audience that the New Testament manuscript tradition is extremely corrupt. That's why it was so useful. And it was not, we've played the clip from that same debate where he said that the New Testament has far earlier manuscript attestation than any other work of antiquity. That was not something I was trying to get him to say. I was simply pressing on his assertion that our earliest manuscripts for Paul, which he had identified as a gigantic gap between the first Pauline fragments, which really aren't fragments, but anyway, the first Pauline manuscripts, and when they were originally written, and the fact that in comparison to other works of that time period, it's a relatively small period of time. I was just wanting to press on the consistency of that. And he's the one that came out with a statement that I never expected at that particular point in time. So he does know. And in other contexts, especially scholarly context, will say things like, we're just tinkering around with the original, we're as close as we're going to get. But then on the other hand, he'll point to a single variant in Mark and a single variant in Hebrews and say, well, it changes the meaning of the entirety of the book. Well, it doesn't by a long shot. Ehrman is normally right on his facts, and the issue becomes the application to overarching principles. That's really where the issue comes down to with Bart Ehrman and the project that he has been pursuing for a couple of decades now, a project that I think is directly related by his own repeated testimony to the fact that he once claimed to believe what he doesn't believe any longer. But then we had these two clips, and we had contacted Ehrman's people. Somebody had gotten us in contact with Ehrman's people about 2 years ago. And that's when we were told, not only does he, I think it was $25,000, but then he has complete control over the distribution of the tapes. All rights to all media. You don't get to do anything with it. If he doesn't like it, there you go. So he's not really open to being challenged on that level. But the fact is, Bart Ehrman, when it comes to theology, is completely Phil Johnson said he was in theology class at Moody Bible Institute with Bart Ehrman. And he said years ago that he did not seem overly interested. And there's good evidence of that. For example, this.
He also makes statements like this.
Paradoxical statements about the Father, the Son, and the Spirit as three separate beings, and yet comprising only one God, the doctrine of the Trinity. There's only one God, but there are three beings, and they're not all the same being. They're three separate beings, but there aren't three gods. There's one God.
Now, that's as bad as what you get from Jehovah's Witnesses. You would expect a credentialed professor who teaches history of religions to at least be able to accurately identify the doctrine of the Trinity. He can't. This wasn't the only place. This was the one. This was the issue. This is the Bass debate. Remember, I couldn't remember what his name was. This was the Bass debate, and this is the very segment that I focused in on and said, I'll debate him anytime, any place on this subject because he's going to lose. He's going to lose badly, and he won't. So for all of you who are going, well, Bart Ehrman, he'll debate anybody. No, he won't. He won't. I guarantee he won't debate this. And if any of you are like really rich Bart Ehrman supporters, why don't you pay his way to get him to do this, and then do a donation to charity type thing. But he's not going to debate this subject because he's wrong. Here's exactly what he said in that debate.
To Bass.
He is definitely not Yahweh or any author of the New Testament. Yahweh and Jesus are different beings in the New Testament.
What's the latter half of the Philippians poem say?
He's honored. He's put at a position with Yahweh. That doesn't make him Yahweh. He is definitely not Yahweh.
Okay, so Romans 10, when he says, whoever calls on the name of the Lord, what's Paul quoting in Romans 10? What's Paul quoting?
Paul thought Jesus was the Lord, yes.
And the Lord is...
Look, if you think that Jesus was Yahweh, you've committed the heresy called Sabellianism.
No.
Which was a 3rd century heresy that said that Jesus and Yahweh were the same being. It was condemned as a heresy in early Christianity, and it continues to be condemned by heresy by every Orthodox Christian on the planet.
Okay, so the man does not know the doctrine of the Trinity. That's embarrassing. He would not pass the most basic level first year Bible college level theology class with his understanding of the Trinity, if those Bible classes they quizzed on the doctrine of the Trinity. But he wouldn't, because that's not Sabellianism. He is assuming Unitarianism, does not seem to understand Trinitarian theology at all. And for someone who derisively laughed at me on the phone when we were preparing the debate in 2009 as knowing anything about history, I can assure you I've read a whole lot more of the Cappadocian Fathers than he has, because you can't read them and then make the statements that he has made. If he can't tell the difference between Sabellianism, modalism, patripassionism, the various different forms, and the recognition that the name Yahweh is used of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit without turning them into one person, he doesn't seem to understand the distinction between being and person. Just doesn't seem to understand any of the 3rd and 4th century discussions of the doctrine of the Trinity, which, there you go. What does that say? And yet he is viewed as the expert on all of these things. And his public statements are his public statements. One other thing from the that is this statement from a little bit early on in the video, which is also rather interesting.
We can only imagine what might have happened if things had turned out differently. If different books, like the Gospel of Thomas, or the Epistle of Barnabas, or the Apocalypse of Peter, had made it into the Bible. If different groups, like the Valentinian Gnostics, or the Marcionites, or the Ebionites, had won more converts than their proto-Orthodox contemporaries, we can only imagine what would have happened.
Yeah, we can only imagine the absolute incoherence of what would have happened if Christianity had been taken over by these perspectives, these understandings. There would be no Christianity today, just there is no Gnosticism today. And the reason being that something like the Gospel of Thomas is so completely outside the worldview of the apostles and prophets, anything that would have come from first century Israel, anything that would have come from the Tanakh, that it could not have possibly been held together and would be utterly indefensible. And that, of course, was the enemy's purpose in all these things.